So I find it really hard to hear some kind of violin song play for Canada's largest financial institutions around this table, that somehow we're talking about risk that's going to bring them down because we want to do something for the person who worked at Sears for 30 years, and paid into a pension plan. It wasn't a gimme. It wasn't a Christmas present. It was something they went to work for. And when that gets cut, that's their rent. That's their groceries. That's their ability to have a nice outing with their partner in their golden years that gets taken away. So I'm not trying to minimize the importance of conversations about risk, but we're talking about people that do risk professionally for a living and get a lot of help from around these tables when things go wrong for them. This is one time that we can do something for people who never get that help. Certainly don't get it often enough. I don't have any questions. I think I've heard enough, frankly. What I want to do is move forward, and if I'm going to hear from anyone, it's going to be people that have real life experiencing being on the wrong end of the current bankruptcy laws, because those are the people we owe our time and service to around this table. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Goldberg, I just thought it would be useful for the committee's deliberation if you could itemize for us or give us a list of the provinces that you think are actively discouraging natural resource development in order to maintain their equalization revenue.
If I could give an itemized list.
Do you believe are actively discouraging resource development in order to maintain their equalization revenue?
Well, what we've seen is that there are provinces all across the country that haven't done enough to develop natural resources. And pardon me?
Ideally, all of them that you think belong to that category. But you could start with one and then carry on to the others.
Well, you know, we spoke about some of the projects that could be developed in Quebec, for example. We've spoken about projects in other regions in Atlantic Canada. I think Mr. Premier Legault and others have talked about wanting to get away from equalization and better developing local economies.
Intention that those governments are actively seeking to not develop their natural resources in order to maintain their equalization revenue. You've said the Atlantic region, so I take that to mean Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, as well as the province of Quebec. Are there any other provinces you'd like to add to that list?
I would not like to make a specific list. What I would say is that there are provinces that have been standing in the way of resource development or getting resources to market. That's a simple fact. And if these provinces were to improve in terms of resource development and you had greater economic growth, then naturally there would be a change to the equalization formula. And that's what happens inevitably when resources are developed.
Well, thank you for the value of that contribution.
On the question that we've been discussing when it comes to collective bargaining rights, I mean, I do think it is disgraceful to see the notwithstanding clause abused in this way. I share Monsieur Saint-Marie's incredulity at seeing Liberals and Conservatives argue over this point, because I've watched Liberals legislate people back to work. I do think that it is a relevant federal issue because this is a precedent. The use of the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause can be used by the federal government as much as it can a provincial government. So if we care about workers' rights to bargain collectively in Canada, it matters when a provincial government does this, because it sets a precedent that can be used by other provinces and by the federal government. So this is not something that a province is doing that is just going to have consequences in its own jurisdiction. This is something that a province is doing that will have repercussions for workers across the country, whether it's other provincial governments or the federal government itself one day that decides to pull this kind of stunt. So I do think we should be properly concerned with this issue around this table. I don't think we can just write it off as a provincial issue. The notwithstanding clause is not simply a provincial issue. It's an issue of our Constitution, which applies rightly across the country and to all levels of government. So now you know what I think about that. To certain members, that appears to be a contradiction. I don't think so at all. It is not a contradiction to support things that you don't think go far enough, that don't contain things that if you had your own druthers would be in there, but because you think there are other good reasons to support it, because there are some things we're supporting in there. The Democrats support the share buyback. We support the pandemic dividend. In fact, that's one of the items that was in the supply and confidence agreement, because we felt that it was very important that financial institutions that benefited substantially from public funds during the pandemic, something that the Conservative leader loves to talk about, should be made to pay some of that money back. And that's what the pandemic dividend is about. And I've been shocked, frankly, at the silence of the Conservative leader on an initiative that is meant to take that very same public money he likes to complain about out of the pockets of financial institutions and deliver it back to Canadians. Not so that it can go to government largesse, and there are real concerns about largesse when it comes to this government, but so that it can go to fund things like the GST rebate that had all party support, I might add, something that New Democrats were fighting for a long time, something that wasn't clear when Bill C-30 was initially tabled, Conservatives would support, and you finally did, and I appreciate that. That was a good thing. But we also believe that you have to have money to pay for it. I hear Conservatives talk about government getting a lot of money and government largesse. Other times they talk about the fact the government still has a large deficit and a huge debt. Well, where do you think paying down the deficit is going to come from if it ain't going to come from revenue? So when we're talking about things like a pandemic dividend that directly target the people that got away with more money than they should have in order to bring it back into government coffers that don't have a balanced budget, that's called tackling a problem. It's not called largesse. It's not called socialism. It's not called whatever other kinds of propagandist terms people would like to use. It's good policy. And it's about actually figuring out a way to solve the problem instead of trying to complain your way into government without actually proposing any real solutions.